the Canadian government released its 2025 budget today, and there were a lot of things in it. This is, in some respects, a big departure for Canada, but in other respects, not so much. And we're going to lay out an argument here. I'm going to be interviewing Chris Bataille, energy economist, about what we see in the budget. And so, welcome to the interview, Chris.
It's great to be here, Markham.
Now, I will have to say to viewers, there's this is from my point of view, a forest and trees issue. So there are lots of trees in the federal budget that deal with energy and trade and so on. But the problem from my point of view is they're not seeing the forest, which is the big picture at the global level, which is the energy transition disruption. So, Chris, if you don't mind, I'm going to lay out my argument that we talked about off camera, and then that will kick off our conversation about the.
Absolutely.
So, okay, so here it goes, folks. The what really struck me is that the federal budget talked about rupture and transition, and I thought initially I went, "Oh, that's great. They're tuned into the energy transition and the disruption caused by new clean energy technologies." No, it turns out that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the rupture of the global trading order, trading system, the world economic order that basically was ushered in after World War II by the Americans. So, it's multilateral trading agreements, that sort of thing. And it's a combination of Donald Trump's tariffs and trade wars and the rise of China as a geopolitical power. So the way the federal government appears to see this is that in responding to that rupture and in the inability to, rely on the Americans the way we used to, we're now going to find new markets in Asia and Europe for our products, our natural resources, and we're going to build new infrastructure like ports and what have you in order to facilitate that new trade. The problem is it doesn't capture the idea that there is a global energy transition going on where the clean energy technologies are pushing out the old fossil fuel combustion technologies, primarily oil and gas, and we're looking at peak oil and gas demand by 2030, decline afterwards. And Chris, the problem here is the government, I think, still wants to go full bore with an expansion of LNG and oil, and it doesn't recognize that the markets for that are going to peak very shortly. So your response to that, sir?
Yeah, my response on reading the budget and thinking about it a little bit is I think we've got a couple of different cooks in the kitchen right now. The different parts of the budget read differently. They have different emphasis on other things. I think you very rightly pointed out, like, the first priority of this government is what do we do about trade and our relationship with the Americans and new trading partners? Like, there's no question that's the number one priority. But then there's this complicated question of how climate change and the energy transition fits into that. And I think some people are thinking one, like the clean competitiveness strategy reads one way, it headlines with that, but other parts of the budget don't. So this is a problem I think countries are wrestling with globally. How do you weave climate and the energy transition into all your other development goals and economic goals and your trade policy and what have you? And I don't think it's been completely woven in here.
I would agree. And one of the things that I think is a fair comment is the Justin Trudeau Liberal government from 2015 to earlier this year really saw the energy transition through a climate lens. And it was all about climate policy, and clean energy policy was kind of a footnote to that. And folks, in the federal budget, today's federal budget, there is a climate competitiveness strategy. That's what Chris is referring to, and it does talk about a little bit about the energy transition, but it still retains, from my point of view, Chris, it still retains that Trudeau-esque focus on climate as a means, the lens of climate to understand energy, as opposed to disruption and the kind of energy transition that you and I talk about all the time.
Yeah, and I think this comes back, this goes to some deeper intellectual roots, to be honest. And as an economist, one of the things that gets drilled into our head is if you've got one market failure, you use one instrument to fix the failure. If you've got two, you use two, right? And there's still a flavor in here of this hope that one simple thing like the industrial pricing strategy can fix all of this, right? And it just can't. It's not broad enough. It can't be made strong enough. Like they talk about tightening it, what have you. It doesn't go under 50,000 for facilities under 50,000 tons per year, ton CO2 per year. What happens to all the light industry? What happens to all the commercial buildings? What happens to our to all, there's nothing, there's a lot of holes in the climate strategy here, and there's somehow a hope of hanging on to that one last bit of the Trudeau era pricing will somehow fix it, and it just won't. You need a comprehensive strategy that does two things. First thing, it covers all the sectors, and it encourages innovation, and it encourages uptake of the new clean technologies, all while maintaining enhancing competitiveness. Like it's a you've got to dance and throw a couple of different batons at the same time, but it can be done.
Yeah, walk and chew gum at the same time. That's what's required here. What I find interesting, Chris, is when it comes to the industrial emitters carbon tax, because that was a big part of the climate policy, as you just mentioned, is that so much of that relies on Alberta, because Alberta is like now 31%
Yes.
of all national emissions, and a lot of it has to do with oil and gas. But here's the thing, the industrial emitters carbon tax is implemented by the provinces. And the Alberta has this tier program, and they've essentially broken it. They've capped the price at $95 a ton, and behind the scenes, which you never see, but I interviewed economist Dave Sawyer, who you know well,
Yes.
about this because he's an expert on it, and he said, look, there's too many credits. And so the effective price of the carbon tax on oil companies and so on is like $20 or $25, which is completely, it does nothing. There's just not enough pressure on the companies for them to respond and lower their emissions. So they're relying on it. They're talking about this in their document, Chris, and it's broken.
Yeah, and the Europeans went through this with their emissions trading system, right? They did. It took them 3 rounds to get it right, and on the set, and the key element that was added on the third round is what's called the market stability reserve. And what it does is it sucks up extra permits when they're in the system, and it puts new permits into the system when necessary. And every successful cap and trade system globally has something that does, like, if permits are becoming too copious and prices collapse onto the floor, it takes them off the table or sets a minimum price. And for political stability reasons and investment, it usually sets a top price one way or another. So new permits get put in, or there's just a top price that's allowed. We have not done this reform here in Canada yet, this market stability mechanism or price stability mechanism. And until we do that, we're going to be worried about hitting the top and usually crashing into the bottom and the price collapsing.
Well, let's move on to talk about oil and gas, because my concern here is that for all of the talk of the other, the climate competitiveness and so on, essentially the government appears that it is still committed to a major expansion of oil and gas exports. And it talked about, the major, one of the first 5 major projects that were approved was LNG Canada Phase 2. LNG Canada Phase 1 was a massive $40 billion project. So Phase 2 would be the same size. And they're talking about other LNG projects as well. In fact, the Prime Minister said, we're going to go from 19 million tons per annum right now to 150 million tons of annum by 2035. So a
Of
major
LNG?
of LNG. That's what he said.
Okay.
I read the speech. I couldn't believe it. So LNG, they got big plans for LNG. Then on top of that, there was no pipeline mentioned, and you and I have discussed this. But the reason for that is because they couldn't find a private proponent for a pipeline. So the Alberta government and Premier Danielle Smith came forward and said, we will be the proponent, but we can't get you a proposal until March. So what was the point of talking about pipelines if the province that wants the pipelines can't get its act together until, for another 5 or 6 months? So, but that doesn't mean that that's not in the works, and we might still see a major expansion of the oil sands and the construction of at least one pipeline.
If I were a betting person, um, I would make it. I would bet it's a fairly sure thing that we're going to maximize TMX into Vancouver. We're going to dredge. We're going to fill those tankers as much as possible. We'll maximize that pipe by every means possible. But I don't think I'd be betting my personal money on a pipeline another crude oil pipeline making it to the west coast. The market is kind of like this. The global market is like this. We're at the frothy top, right? We don't know quite where peak oil demand is going to be, right? But it's not going to go a whole lot higher, right? Like transport demand is we're seeing numbers day by day here where many developing countries, more than half of vehicles being sold are electric, right? Even though demand keeps on going, the demand for oil is just like the one firm part of it is chemical production. So I think we're going to be at a frothy place here for at least 5 years where we don't know if oil demand's going up or down. It might crack 110 maybe, but and even then it's going to fall off. I don't think the business case here. I think we maximize the pipes we have. We do use them as best as possible. We maybe do some more southern exports, what have you. But I don't think we're going much higher than that. And if the market gets flooded with dilbit inside Alberta, that could crash prices yet again. We end up back with that 20+% discount on Hardisty oil. But that's where I sit.
I will take that bet. And I'll tell you why, because there's a counter argument to your point. If the federal government thought like you and I do about the energy transition and global oil and gas markets, particularly oil markets, then that might be one thing. But I've established pretty firmly, I think, in my correspondence with Natural Resources Canada, which is basically the Department of the Energy Minister Tim Hodgson, that all of the worldview, the way they view, the minister and his department view the future of global oil is all seen through modeling of a very conservative type, meaning that the OPEC, ExxonMobil, U.S. Energy Information Administration, and so on, and the International Energy Agency STEP scenarios all show either business as usual or significant growth out to 2050. That is what informs their view of the energy future. So whatever you think about markets being frothy and when peak demand is going to come, they don't think peak demand is going to come. They believe, based on the modeling I just mentioned, that there's going to be significant expansion out to 2050. And the industry here and Premier Daniel Smith believe that as well. And I would bet that there's at least a 70-30 chance that the project will be approved with Alberta leading. They'll have a Crown Corporation and they will lead that project. And there will at least be one proposed and it'll go well down the approval process before maybe market conditions might stop it, but maybe not.
Yeah, we'll have to see. I think there's a lot of bumps on that road. There are both economic bumps, there's technical bumps, there's political bumps, there's Aboriginal title bumps.
Yeah.
It looks really bumpy to me, to be honest. What I find interesting too is look at the Americans' interest in Venezuela at this point in time. That is the other very large storehouse of bitumen in the world. Right? And if that was actually activated yet again on any scale, that puts a whole other wrinkle into this. Even if in a world where oil demand is coming down, as you've said before, there's only so much demand for heavy out there. And if a whole other player our size of Venezuelan bitumen comes back on the market, that could changes all this calculus yet again.
Yeah, let's a little context for viewers. Venezuela actually has a bigger reserve of bitumen than Alberta does. It's the only country in the world that does. And 10, 15 years ago, before all their political troubles, they were exporting 2.5 million barrels a day of it, and most of it went to the United States. Since then, they're down to about 250,000 or 300,000 barrels, like 10 to 15% of what they were, and all of their infrastructure has rusted and gone into disrepair. So Donald Trump is talking about overthrowing Maduro, the president there in Venezuela, and maybe the speculation is that the Americans might take over that the Venezuelan heavy crude oil industry. But I don't think so, Chris. I think that there's been too much damage done to the infrastructure and refineries in the extraction sector that it would just be too costly and they would never get it up and running in time. So I kind of view that as a long shot, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so I guess where we're at here now in our discussion of the federal budget is that we are going to, I mean, what are we going to see on the clean energy side? There was mention of, and this is interesting because since Carney became prime minister, he ran on a national power grid, interties and connecting all or most of the grids in Canada. And it has almost fallen off the public discussion in the last 6 months, but it made it back into the budget in a small way. What did you make of that?
Yeah, no, I was about to say there's several different mechanisms and pots of money in there that could be used for more transmission and could be used to lever more transmission. Notably, the clean electricity regulation is still in there. Notably, the electricity availability regulation is still in there, and it's likely to be delayed. It'll just be pushed out into the future. I think most of the existing mechanisms are going to stay. They'll probably get loosened and adjusted a bit, but they're going to stay there. But it's not all integrated. It's not all kind of thought out as a plan in a, this is how things might roll out together. That it might be too much to expect that at this point in time, but I would love to see over the coming year some thought put into how do we take all these pots of money, how do we take all these infrastructure funds, how do we take these regulations and get them to all work together in a synergistic way. And I really would like to see them work together with the oil and gas system as it is in terms of bringing down its emissions intensity, maximizing returns on the production, what production there is to Albertans, to people from Saskatchewan and the rest of Canada, and contributing to our net fiscal balance, right? That is what an inherent sort of transition to a clean energy system would look like for Canada if we were really thinking on a long-term scale.
We've been complaining here at Energy Media for a couple of years, well, a number of years now, that the Canada needs an energy strategy. And I've talked to other energy economists like yourself, and they say, Canada doesn't take a very strategic approach to its energy exports or its energy sectors. And I think you've put your finger on it, is that in this document, there's no sense that the government has this big overarching strategy, at least for energy, that all the pieces fit together, that it's well thought out. And there's not only a strategy, there's a plan, and here's how we're going to do it. And here are the policy levers and the regulations that are required. Here's the money, here's the other, whatever, policies we're going to need. It just seems kind of amorphous. It's kind of loosey goosey. And I know you and I would both like to see a strategy.
Yeah, and that may be the opportunity that is lying before us right now. Like, we're still in a moment of crisis. We don't know what's going to happen on the trade front. Debts are the debt picture deficit picture is not looking great. We need to maximize every revenue source we have, and we need to spend our capital carefully in a way that's going to really pay out over time. And we may be looking at election if this budget doesn't come through, or we don't. But the one thing that would take this budget and make it make sense is a longer term plan as to how all the components work together. And if we get another year here of political stability, that may be the biggest thing that could happen.
I agree with you, and that would be the best thing that could happen. The problem is I don't see the momentum for it. I don't see national figures, like there aren't MPs, for example, who are championing a national strategy. We don't have Hodgson, the energy minister, or Mark Carney, the prime minister. Neither one of them talk much about strategy. Now, having said all of that, and this maybe illustrates the conversation we're having, Chris, is the prime minister has talked for months now. We're going to have a well thought out, coherent industrial strategy,
Mhm.
and we're going to put it in the budget. And so the budget came down. And yes, there is kind of an industrial strategy, but I would not call it strategic, nor would I call it coherent. What was your take on it?
No, but again, this is where the too many cooks with different perspectives point of view I kind of see in the budget document, right? I think you're still dealing with a lot of players who come from the last 20, 30 years where industrial strategy was a bad word or a bad phrase, right? You didn't say something like that. You let the markets do its thing. But what we've sort of learned, by trial and error here is that government and the private sector work together, especially on these really big projects, right? Government, they work together in a long-term strategy. Government helps backstops the loan on the major infrastructure. Then private industry builds the projects in and onto that infrastructure, right? Like this is how China has really, like, been looking at a lot of this recently. This is how China launched forward and did 120 years worth of development in 20 years. Was a very careful dance between their private and their state sectors. We're not going to go all that way, but we've got to go back. We've done this in the past here in Canada. That's how we made our big jumps in industrialization. But we've got to go back to something like that, where we've got a playbook we're operating to, and government enables the private sector.
Yes, and people like Professor Bentley Allen, who I've interviewed him many times on about Canadian industrial policy, and the point he makes is that modern industrial policy is all about, yes, government provides some leadership, but it's all about getting the stakeholders together, cooperating and headed in the right direction. So it's not just the government and the private sector. It could be labor. It could be provincial and municipal governments. It could
First Nations.
First Nations, yes, of course. First Nations, so the approach here is a much more should be much more sophisticated. Here's a problem, Chris, and I've heard this from a number of sources, that the federal government prior to 1980, as you mentioned, used to do industrial policy. And then it stopped because it adopted kind of the Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan model, where it was all about markets, and government was just supposed to sit back and regulate and do monetary policy. And China is swinging that pendulum back now. Now we're thinking everybody has to do industrial policy. We don't have the horses in the finance department anymore who have that expertise. We don't have the economists who have been doing this for 5 or 10 or 50. We don't have engineers. China is full of engineers who are working on these kinds of problems all the time. We don't have the best and the brightest who are versed in how to do industrial policy and have any kind of an experience at it. And I fear that that's going to be a limiting factor, is we're unprepared.
We're unprepared, but we've got people who could do this, right? But the question is getting them on board and into those positions and having those conversations, as you said, stakeholder conversations with all the major firms and the governments at all the major levels, and everyone understanding what's possible and what might pay out in the long haul, where we need to go. I think we could make these changes pretty quickly if we were at it. We went from almost no industrial capacity before World War One and World War Two to having a ton of it, right? In planning capacity, using the people we had at that point of time. We were mostly coming out of agricultural colleges, right? So I think we'd do all right, but we have to actually know that there's a problem and we need to do something about it. That's actually the problem here. I don't see that vision in the budget document we have.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to tell you a little anecdote. So in 2022, I was a panelist at a conference in Ottawa. It was about industrial policy. And on the panel sat Michael Wernick. And Michael Wernick was the clerk of the Privy Council, which is, for folks who don't know, that is Canada's top bureaucrat. Now he retired in 2019, and he's now teaching economics at the University of Ottawa or Carleton, I forget which. And he led the pushback against industrial policy, and he and I got into it and had a pretty good argument. And his argument was Canada has always muddled through. And yes, there's disruption coming, and yes, there's big change coming. Don't worry about strategy. We will muddle through. Somehow, I don't know how it'll do. We'll make it up as we go, but we'll muddle through. And you and I think, would agree that the days of muddling through are done or should be done. That's not how a sophisticated economy like Canada operates in the 21st century.
No, the folks who've been developing the fastest and most successfully do not muddle through. They have plans, they have adjustable plans, they have visions of where they're going, and they run experiments, and some things work, some things don't, and they're conscious about learning from them. The South Koreans are probably a prime example. The Japanese at one point, the South Koreans, the Chinese have really picked it up. That's the model for how you move really quickly in this kind of environment. It's not muddling. Muddling through was okay when time lag. You had years to respond. We don't have years to respond.
And nor do we have the Americans anymore. We can't
No,
rely
no,
on
no,
the
no. We don't.
Americans
We
like
don't
we
have
used to.
that deep bench that bench is antagonistic now.
Yeah, they're the opposing team, and we've been playing on the same side for a long time. Now they're the opposing team. So I guess to wrap up our discussion on the budget, Chris, there is lots of good stuff in here. There are
Mhm.
a lot of trees, including, I might add, and this is kind of funny. Remember how Justin Trudeau brought in one of his budgets, there were going to be 2 billion trees planted by such and such a date, and
Yeah.
almost none of them got planted. Well, that program with the exact same number of trees is back in the budget, and the date
Okay.
now is 2030, 2031. So my point is, we got lots of trees. What we don't have is a clear view of the forest. And I think that's what we need. And you and I are pretty much in agreement on the basics around this. And I will bet you that, and I can tell you this much, I probably got a dozen statements from various stakeholders, business and NGOs and stuff in my inbox responding to the federal budget, and none of them have taken the perspective that you and I have taken here. The strategic perspective is absent.
Yeah. I guess the one last thing I'd want to put on the table here, right? And we were talking about emissions caps and pathways and what have you. We've been talking about something like pathways since the 1990s, right? Like this has been in my discussion community since then. We talked and talked and talked and talked. We didn't actually try to build something, break equipment, and get it to finally work. That's the world we need to go into. We need to start actually experimenting with things and seeing what actually does work and doesn't work, and stop tinkering.
Yeah, I mean, think about China. When it decided to scale up its auto industry and basically eat the global auto sector,
Yeah,
it at one time had 700 EV makers, 700,
yeah.
and then they let them compete. I mean, it was this vicious competition between all of those companies. And eventually it got down. There were 200 companies, and then there were 100 companies. And then last year, the government came out and said, well, we think, 12 would be a nice round number. And, so everybody now was competing to be one of the 12, but they broke a lot of stuff and they spent, tens of billions of dollars in the process of breaking that stuff. But at the end of the day, China is now the center of the automaking industry in the world. And
So
so,
go ahead.
no, over to you.
No, for our next conversation, I've seen reports that China is now dispatching that model and that capital to the industrial sector. Right. So it's now moving to steel, cement, and chemicals, and making hydrogen for those kinds of things, not for cars, not for heat, for like all that kind of like stuff and electrification of their industrial sector. They are about to launch into that zone now with this model. So we'll see how this goes.
And we don't want to get into that. That is grist for another conversation, Chris. But if China is doing that and plans to dominate those other areas, because those are some of the areas where Canada is actually competitive, and we would be facing that competition from China, all the more reason, all the more urgency for us to be strategic like our competitors.
Yeah. Yeah. We have to realize now the benchmark is no longer the Americans. The benchmark is the Chinese.
And I will say, and we're going to end this interview on a positive note, we're going to say something nice about the Carney government, is they made a point all through the budget document to talk about how the world has changed.
Yep.
This is not the world of our parents or our grandparents. This is a whole new ball game. And you and I would disagree with Mark Carney and Tim Hodgson on what that means, but nevertheless, they at least get it that this is, the world is changing and we have to do something different. And that maybe can shake up the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm also kind of conscious that they're being lobbied by many, many, many people all at once. And it's okay for us to talk here on a screen about what you should do, but they have to do it with all this pressure on them. But it's, as you say, the world has changed. We've got to change how we operate.
On that note, Chris, thank you very much for this.
My pleasure. Anytime, Mark.